Good evening, and thank you for inviting me here to speak today. I want to begin by thanking the CCN for the work that you do in championing the voices of England's county authorities on the national stage. And I want to thank the thousands of councillors and council officers and staff who demonstrate the commitment that you all have to representing your communities through all of your work. Now, in the Chairman's welcome yesterday, Councillor Paul Carter spoke of the funding crisis that many of you are facing. And the scale of the cuts facing the counties are impossible to ignore. And I hope that you will see in me an ally in the fight for sustainable funding for local government. Now, I want to thank Councillor Simon Hennig for introducing me here today, and also for your continued role as a leader for Labour in local government. Thank you for your great work both at the Association of Labour Councillors and here at the CCN. I also want to pay tribute to the former chairman of CCN and chairman of the LGA's Resources Committee, Ken Thornber, a hugely respected politician who played a pivotal role in Hampshire over 40 years. A man equally passionate about the importance of local government to have a voice on the national stage, and our thoughts and condolences are with his family and his former colleagues. Now, conference, it's a privilege to be with you here today on the eve of an important budget. But I'm not interested in the budget because the Chancellor needs to balance the fragile truce amongst the factions at war within the Parliamentary Conservative Party. And it isn't important to me as an opportunity for the government to revive its image amongst young people. It isn't even important because it may be the Chancellor's last budget, if we're to believe the newspapers. On Wednesday, the government has an opportunity to show that it is listening to the local government sector. And Labour will be joining with the LGA and the CCN and others in calling for the Chancellor to address the funding gap in local government. Because we all know that across the country, local government has seen an overall budget cut of 40%. Now that seems unthinkable. I was just talking to Simon about my experience as a councillor many years ago for the 12 years on Tameside Council, and we had 12 years of budget growth, and it's unthinkable to think that in a couple of years we will have had a decade of austerity and cuts to our budgets. And yet even with that tight financial situation, many local councils can be proud of the work that you do in delivering quality public services in spite of those financial circumstances. Now, we were told that austerity was the solution to the economic crisis, that the cupboard was bare, that cuts were needed because there was no money. Now, you'd expect me as a Labour MP to say this, but whilst councillors of all parties and none have been forced to ration and cut services, a few at the top have done extremely well, supported by a government willing to give tax handouts to those at the top, rather than investing in our public services for the most vulnerable in our communities. And when local authorities are forced to cut back on core services, whether that's the disposal of waste, running children's centres, providing care to the elderly, even then you're still unable to balance your books. We must all agree that there is something seriously wrong with the management of finances coming from central government to local government. And there is now a growing consensus that the austerity experiment has failed and its time is up. But in its place, I'm afraid to say, have emerged political uncertainty and economic black holes in the government's plans for local government finance. Local government are rightly demanding a new deal from this government and from the next government. But now the cupboard appears to be truly bare. And whilst we're talking about things like smashed avocados and millennials, and that might generate headlines, it shows really the scale of the problem. a problem created by a long-term policy in resisting calls from the cross-party LGA, from others, from the Labour Party, for example, to lift the borrowing cap on housing. These problems will not be resolved by turning members of our community against each other, pitting baby boomers against millennials or local authorities against one another. It only serves as a distraction for a government that is unwilling or unable to fix the problem. But councillors of all parties and none know that we can't go on like this. We have to start seriously investing in our people, in our public services, in our economy at a local level and in our communities. Now, we're all aware of the rising demand and the challenges that that poses to local councils of all types. Researchers at UCL this week have linked austerity policies to more than 120,000 avoidable deaths over the past 7 years. It was found that rising demand alongside decreasing health and social care budgets will contribute towards an extra 100 unnecessary deaths every day until 2020 unless we change policy course. By 2025, Skills for Care have predicted that we will need an additional 220,000 to 470,000 workers because of population growth and ageing, and that's just to maintain the current level of service. Now, more and more people, as you will know, are needing support with their mental health, with their physical disability, with their learning disability, or with their social needs. And as we know, despite the various sticking plasters that there have been, under current and projected budgets, local government will just be unable to meet this demand. Now, similar trends are seen in children's services, something that I am absolutely passionate about. And research that we in the Labour Party have done has found that child protection cases have doubled in the past 7 years. And Section 41 inquiries have hit an all-time high, with 1 in 64 children now at risk of neglect and in need of safeguarding in England. And our research, unsurprisingly, shows that rural and county areas have been hit the hardest. So it's clear we don't have to wait until 2025 to witness the crisis in children's or adult social care, because across the country right now, our health and social care system is straining at the seams. And these cuts hurt all of our communities, whichever party we may represent and whichever type of council we represent. And in a recent poll by the Evening Standard, over half of Conservative councillors said that the government's cuts have made it difficult to deliver legally required services, and 3/4 had major concerns about their own capacity to deliver children's services. This is something that I pressed ministers on at the previous CLG question time in Parliament. We all want to give our vulnerable children the best start and opportunities in life. But the system needs to be properly funded and sustainable in order to do this. And the sector, yourselves, you're warning rightly that the cuts are driving services to breaking point. That's why Labour will be joining with others in calling for the government to address the £2 billion funding gap in children's services at the budget, and urgent action is needed to ensure that rural and county areas receive the support that you need. But we also need sustainable forms of funding, because no longer can funding be regressively focused on past spending. Instead, it needs to be focused and based on the delivery of current and future services, and in that, increasing demand and increasing public expectation. Ensuring that local government in England has an adequate funding base to provide core services is not something that should even be up for debate. It should be a given. And that's why I'm pleased about your New Deal report, because many of the challenges we're all facing will not be solved if the cuts continue. We've had austerity, falling wages, and this has created a real desire for real change. And you are now on the right side of that political argument. There is a desire for a new deal in local government with fresh ideas and good quality leadership, a desire to provide the funding needed for our schools, our hospitals, our public services and our public sector workers. Now, during the recent general election, the Labour Party lay out an alternative vision for Britain, and I realise that not everybody in this room are Labour politicians. But I genuinely believe that people listened to our message during that campaign. And many people, for the first time in years, even if they didn't ultimately vote for my party, started to feel hope that things could be different. And that is the message that we will be continuing to take to the country in the weeks, the months and the years ahead, reaching out to the growing numbers of people who have turned their backs on austerity, who don't believe that falling living standards and an economy that only benefits a privileged few should be the way to govern this country. But despite the challenges this sector, the local government sector, has faced, you have been at the forefront of protecting communities and the local services that people rely on. And I want to say a very genuine and heartfelt thank you to each and every one of you in this room. We national politicians, and perhaps this is the former councillor in me, but we national politicians do not say thank you nearly enough to those of you that are serving the public diligently, day in and day out on the front line. You get the flack, but you make a real difference to each and every one of your communities. And irrespective of party differences, each and every one of you should be really proud of the work that you do in serving your local communities. Now, my pledge to you is this, that you will be at the forefront of delivering that better, fairer and more equal society that the next Labour government will want to create. That means recognising the expertise and potential within local government, delivering meaningful devolution to our rural and county communities, as well as to our cities and metropolitan areas. And the most important thing, and it's the thing that gives me sleepless nights day in, day out, rebuilding that capacity in our local communities to be able to deliver that radical agenda for change from the grassroots up. This is the new deal that I want to see between you in local government and the next Labour government, working together as partners, drawing on the knowledge that you have for your local economies, reforming local government finance, and delivering sustainable funding through place-based reforms. I'm proud to stand here, conference, as your advocate for local government in Westminster. And I look forward, hopefully, to soon having the opportunity to serve you as your Secretary of State. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those words, Andrew. We've got a few minutes for any questions that anybody would like to ask. There are a couple of hands towards the back. Thank you. If you can just introduce yourselves as well. Thank you.
Hello, Anne Weston from Derbyshire. Thank you, Andrew, for that. It's been an interesting day today, sitting in this room, and we spent a lot of time sitting in this room listening to various speakers. And it just feels like every initiative that councillors and council leaders want to take has received a pushback. The delayed transfer of care issue, there was a suggestion that now is the time. for a shift of funding away from the acute sector into community health, primary care, social care. Oh, now is not the time. The fair funding model that Leicestershire has developed, oh, now is not the time, the government won't. So if, in your position at Westminster, if there was one thing we could take from this conference that you think this government would act on, what would it be? Because it just feels as if this frustration around the room, devolution, reorganisation, social care, health, children's services, which one would you go for if you thought there was a chance of delivering something for as long as this government lasts?
We're going to take them as clusters? Or?
Okay, should we take the second one? There's one there. Thank you.
Cornelius Olivier from Cornwall. I'm very glad to hear you mention the importance of extending devolution, effective devolution, to rural areas. Obviously, Cornwall is one of those. I just wanted to, I'm not asking for a definitive answer here, but in terms of genuine autonomy and devolution, how do you feel about actually giving us the powers to set our own council tax, our own business rates, allowing within that that some places haven't got the tax raising abilities of others and therefore would need some kind of compensation. I'm sorry, that's quite a big question. I'm not expecting a definitive commitment or anything like that, but I'd be interested to know what you think.
Okay, thank you. Andrew, do you want to come back on?
Okay. Well, firstly, I'll deal with Anne Weston. I mean, you're absolutely right. There are some very important issues there in terms of how we deal with the social care crisis, and I don't think that it's appropriate for the Secretary of State to be fining councils on delayed transfers of care. I think that seems to be a bit of a perverse incentive, and actually we need to be tackling the root cause of the DTOC issue in those local areas. For me, though, the fundamental issue, and it kind of comes on to the Cornwall question, is the issue of fair funding and the issue of local government finance, because without getting local government finance right and working in the best interests of the local government community, actually we're paying lip service to everything else, whether it's children's services, public services or adult social care. We need to get fair funding and we need to get local government finance right. Now, in terms of devolution, I am a strong advocate of fiscal autonomy and giving stronger powers at the local level so that local communities can develop the fiscal policies that will work for their areas. And we're starting to see that develop in some of the big city regions, my own included, in Greater Manchester, where they've got the 100% retention of business rates. Now, the reason I've used that as an example, and I appreciate that that's a metropolitan city region, very different to Cornwall, but within the city region, if it wasn't for that close cooperation, there are very real differences between the authorities that make up Greater Manchester. So there are 10 metropolitan borough councils. Literally, I think 3 of them are net beneficiaries from the local retention of business rates. City of Manchester, because they've got the airport and they've got the city centre, Salford, because they've got Media City and Salford Quays, and Trafford MBC, because they've got Trafford Centre and Trafford Park, big generators of business rates. Stockport, which is one of the 2 local authorities that makes up my constituency, just about breaks even as a standalone borough, were it to retain all of its business rates. But Tameside would need to build another 20 IKEAs just to break even. And all the other boroughs around Greater Manchester, Oldham, Rochdale, Bury, Bolton, Wigan, they're in a similar boat. But by pooling and sharing across the whole city region, it just about works for Greater Manchester. And that then means you can have a really smart conversation. Where are the business growth opportunities? So rather than 10 councils chasing after the same pot of gold, you can actually decide that actually the real growth opportunities around the airport or around the Trafford Centre, and therefore that's where you build the economic growth in the city region. And what you do with the proceeds of that growth is you then make sure that the kids in my constituency are adequately skilled to access those jobs, and that the transport infrastructure is put in place so they can physically get to those jobs. And that close cooperation allows you to have that smart thinking. But what works in Greater Manchester isn't necessarily going to work in Cornwall. So we've got to look at ways that we can develop a local government system of finance that reflects on the differences and the abilities of each area to generate income. And we should have a set amount of funding that reflects the service needs of an area, and I think that is really important going forward. We can talk about fair funding, but it isn't fair if you can't afford to fund even the most basic services.
Okay, there's time for one more if anybody wants to ask another question. Is there one more there? Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Ivan Henderson, councillor for Harwich on Essex County Council. I just wondered what your position will be on the ridiculous situation where we've got on the Bus Services Act, where only those authorities where they've got elected mayors can take on the full accountability and responsibilities for running bus services for the desperate need of passengers within our areas. Would we revisit that Bus Services Act and then allow all councils to take advantage of those regulations?
That's a really good question, Ivan, and certainly when the bill was going through Parliament, the Labour Party in both the House of Commons and in the House of Lords tried to amend the bill so that all authorities could take on those powers. I think it's absolutely crazy that it's only those areas that have devolved elected mayors in a city region or combined authority that can take on those powers. And actually, when you look at what has happened to the public transport network, it's actually in the counties and in some of the more rural and sparsely populated areas that have seen the biggest cuts to public transport networks because the deregulated system actually works against the public interest, because, you know, unless you've got enough money to subsidise a bus service, a lot of those rural bus services just aren't sustainable. And of course, they're on the front line for many of the service reductions through funding cuts that councils have had to make. What we really need is a system where the profit-making services cross-subsidise the non-profit-making services, rather than basically the bus companies getting a double whammy of a profit from the profit-making services and then also a subsidy from the local authority for the other services. We need to have a smarter way of using what money there is in public transport.
Andrew, thank you very much for coming along to address the County Council Network Conference. I'm also delighted that Andrew's staying on, so he'll be at the dinner this evening, and it's really good to see the Shadow Secretary of State giving up a few hours of what are always busy days at the moment, I know, in Parliament to come and share his thoughts with us. So can we thank Andrew? Thank you very much.